The Myth of Sisyphus. Act 1. The Rise of the Cunning King. In the days when gods walked closer to the earth, when the boundary between mortal ambition and divine will remained thin as morning mist, there was born to Aeolus, king of Thessaly, a son whose very name would echo through the ages as a warning whispered in the darkness of Hades itself. Sisyphus came into the world beneath storm-laden skies, the sixth son of royal blood, born into a house where brothers plotted against brothers, and ambition ran thicker than wine in the veins of kings. The birth itself was marked by portents that the court seers struggled to interpret. Thunder rolled across clear skies when the child drew his first breath, and the sacred spring that fed the palace ran backward for the span of 3 heartbeats. The old priestess who attended the birth claimed she saw eagles circling the tower, though no eagles nested in those mountains. And she whispered to her sisters that the child's eyes opened before his first cry, as though he came into the world already calculating its possibilities. The palace of Aeolus rang with the laughter and quarrels of princes who would each seek to carve their names upon the map of Hellas. There was Athamas, destined to rule Orchomenus, his eyes already calculating the wealth of grain fields. There was Salmoneus, whose arrogance would one day lead him to claim equality with Zeus himself, demanding sacrifice and worship as though thunder answered to his call. There was Cretheus, who would found Iolcus and Father Jason's lineage, and Perieres, who dreamed of southern kingdoms. And there was Sisyphus, the child who learned to walk by watching his brother's every step, who spoke his first words not in wonder, but in questions that cut to the heart of weakness and desire. Even as the youngest princes played at wooden swords and horses, Sisyphus observed the games of power that surrounded him. He noticed how his father's ministers bent their words when speaking of certain subjects, how visiting kings smiled with their mouths while their eyes calculated advantage, how the servants' gossip often proved more accurate than the official reports of ambassadors. While his brothers practiced spearwork and chariot racing, Sisyphus haunted the corridors of the palace, learning to move so quietly that adults forgot his presence and spoke freely of matters they believed beyond a child's understanding. Even as a boy, Sisyphus possessed a mind that worked like quicksilver, catching the light of every conversation, every glance, every unspoken tension that passed between the adults who ruled his world. He learned to read the silences between his father's words, to understand that power was not simply inherited, but seized, held, and protected by those clever enough to see opportunity where others saw only custom. The nurses whispered that he never cried as an infant, but watched with eyes too old for his face, as though he had been born understanding that tears were the first weakness a king must abandon. By his 8th year, Sisyphus had begun to demonstrate the gift that would define his destiny. When merchants came to trade with the royal household, the boy would position himself where he could observe their negotiations. He learned to recognize the tells that revealed when a man was lying, when a woman was desperate, when both parties to a bargain believed they held the superior position. His tutors praised his quick mind for letters and numbers, but they grew uncomfortable when he applied the same analytical precision to their own words, catching them in contradictions and exposing the gaps in their knowledge with questions that seemed innocent but cut deep. The court began to whisper about the strange prince who seemed to understand too much, too young. Visiting nobles would find their private conversations somehow became common knowledge shortly after the boy had been seen in their vicinity. Servants discovered that tasks assigned in secret were mysteriously completed before they could begin them, as though someone had overheard instructions never meant for young ears. Yet no one could prove the child had done anything wrong, for he was always where he was supposed to be, always perfectly behaved, always ready with a smile that never quite reached those calculating eyes. When Sisyphus reached his 16th year, the time came for the sons of Aeolus to seek their fortunes beyond their father's hall. The tradition demanded that each prince prove himself capable of ruling by establishing his own domain, whether through conquest, marriage, or the founding of new settlements. His brothers departed to claim kingdoms in the fertile valleys of mainland Greece, each following paths that seemed ordained by their natures and ambitions. Athamas marched north with a formidable host, seeking to carve out territory through strength of arms. Salmoneus chose the rich lands of Elis, where he could impose himself upon established communities. Cretheus looked toward the coasts, where he might build a maritime kingdom. But Sisyphus looked south, toward the narrow bridge of land that connected the great peninsula to the northern kingdoms. While his brothers saw glory in commanding vast armies or ruling ancient cities, he recognized something more valuable than immediate power: position. There, where traders' ships passed between eastern seas and western harbors, where the very throat of commerce could be grasped by the right hand, he saw possibility gleaming like gold in sunlight. Others might rule more land, command more soldiers, or inherit greater treasures, but none would control what he intended to control: the flow itself. The decision puzzled his father's advisors, who counseled the young prince to seek easier conquests. The isthmus was wild, they argued, inhabited by rough mountain folk who would not easily bend the knee. It lacked the fertile plains that could support large armies, the ancient temples that commanded religious authority, or the established trade routes that guaranteed immediate wealth. Why struggle to build something new when there were kingdoms ripe for taking through marriage or conquest? Sisyphus listened to their counsel with the appearance of respectful attention, nodding at appropriate moments and asking questions that suggested he valued their wisdom. But privately, he had already completed calculations that reached far beyond their conventional thinking. He understood that inheriting power made one subject to the expectations and limitations that came with it, while creating power from nothing allowed one to set the terms by which it would operate. An ancient kingdom came with ancient enemies, old debts, established ways of doing things that constrained a ruler's options. A new kingdom could be built according to one's own design. The isthmus lay wild and largely unconquered, protected by hills and watered by springs that bubbled up from deep within the earth. Ancient peoples had built settlements there, but none had recognized the true prize that geography offered. The land itself seemed to resist easy conquest, with rocky soil that demanded patience and skill to cultivate, harbors that required significant work to clear and fortify, and mountain passes that could be easily defended but were difficult to control. Previous attempts at major settlement had failed, leaving behind ruins that served as warnings to the overly ambitious. Sisyphus arrived with a modest retinue and eyes that measured every slope, every harbor, every path that merchants might travel. Where others saw rugged coastline and tangled hills, he envisioned walls rising from cliff tops, harbors filled with ships from distant lands, and roads converging like the spokes of a wheel upon a single magnificent center. His first months in the isthmus were spent not in building, but in learning, walking every trail, mapping every stream, talking with the scattered inhabitants about patterns of weather and trade that previous settlers had ignored. The local tribes watched the young prince with suspicion born of experience. They had seen ambitious men come before, full of grand plans and quick to demand tribute or labor. Most such men departed when they discovered that the isthmus yielded its gifts grudgingly, requiring patience and wisdom rather than force. But this one was different. He came not with ultimatums, but with questions, not with demands, but with offers. He learned their language, participated in their festivals, and listened to their stories with an attention that seemed genuine rather than calculated. Slowly, carefully, Sisyphus began to weave the first threads of his great design. He negotiated agreements that appeared to benefit all parties, while gradually establishing his authority as the natural mediator for disputes, the obvious coordinator for shared projects, the logical center around which the scattered communities might organize themselves. When tribal leaders disagreed about fishing rights, he proposed solutions that seemed fair to all while establishing precedents for his role as arbiter. When traders needed safe passage through contested territory, he provided it in exchange for modest fees that seemed reasonable, but gradually created a web of obligation and dependency. He named his city Ephyra, after the mountain nymph whose streams fed the land. But from the first day of its founding, it was clear that this would be no ordinary settlement. Sisyphus planned each street with the precision of a spider weaving its web, ensuring that all commerce, all traffic, all movement of goods and people would flow through channels he controlled. He understood that trade was the lifeblood of cities, and that he who controlled the flow of blood controlled the heart itself. The location he chose for his city center was itself a masterwork of strategic thinking. Positioned at the narrowest point of the isthmus, it commanded both the eastern and western approaches to the peninsula. Ships seeking to avoid the dangerous southern route around the Great Capes would find themselves naturally drawn to Ephyra's harbors. Caravans traveling overland between the northern kingdoms and the southern settlements would discover that the city offered the safest, most direct route through territories that Sisyphus gradually brought under his influence. But the true genius of Ephyra's design lay not in its military advantages, but in its commercial inevitability. Sisyphus built not a fortress that might be besieged or bypassed, but a marketplace that became increasingly difficult to ignore. He established trade festivals that coincided with the sailing seasons, created standardized weights and measures that simplified negotiations, and instituted a system of commercial courts that provided predictable justice for disputes. Merchants who might have planned to pass through quickly found reasons to linger, opportunities to profit, connections that drew them back season after season. The early years of Ephyra's growth were marked by Sisyphus's particular gift for turning circumstance to advantage. When pirates raided coastal settlements, he offered protection for a price that seemed modest, but that established the precedent of his authority over sea lanes. When merchants feared the mountain passes, he built roads and charged passage fees, that gradually created a monopoly over the safest routes. When rival settlements competed for the same trade routes, he negotiated treaties that somehow always left Ephyra holding the key to the most profitable arrangements. His subjects began to prosper, and prosperity bred loyalty, though those who looked closely might have wondered at the price others paid for their king's success. For Sisyphus had learned early that there were two kinds of wisdom in the world: the wisdom that bent the knee to accepted ways, and the wisdom that saw how accepted ways might be bent to serve one's purposes. He received guests with honor, as custom demanded, offering them the finest accommodations, the richest foods, the most entertaining company his court could provide. Yet somehow these guests, who arrived expecting the simple hospitality due to travelers, found themselves drawn into increasingly complex negotiations. A merchant seeking safe passage might discover opportunities for exclusive trading partnerships. A diplomat carrying messages between distant kings might learn of intelligence that could benefit his own ruler, available in exchange for certain considerations. The sacred laws of hospitality protected all who came under Sisyphus's roof, but they said nothing about what agreements might be reached during their stay. Contracts were written in language that seemed clear, but contained snares for the unwary. Obligations that revealed their true weight only with time and circumstance. For a time, guests departed with their persons and dignity intact, their immediate needs fulfilled, their official missions accomplished, yet somehow finding themselves bound by webs of obligation they had not fully understood when first they gave their consent. But as Sisyphus's power grew, so too did his appetite for more direct methods of acquiring what he desired. The subtle manipulations that had once satisfied him began to seem insufficient, too slow, too dependent upon the cooperation of others. Why should he wait months or years for carefully crafted contracts to yield their profits when more immediate solutions lay within his grasp? The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but those who served him closely began to notice changes in their king's methods. Wealthy merchants who arrived at Ephyra's gates began to disappear with disturbing frequency. Their retinues would report that their masters had departed early, leaving behind sealed letters explaining urgent business elsewhere. The letters bore authentic seals, the handwriting matched perfectly, and the explanations seemed reasonable to those who did not look too closely. But the missing merchants were never seen again in any of the cities they supposedly sought to reach. The truth was darker than even the most suspicious observers imagined. Sisyphus had discovered that certain travelers carried wealth that could be obtained more efficiently through murder than through negotiation. Those who arrived without strong political connections, whose disappearance would not trigger investigations or reprisals, found themselves invited to private audiences that ended in hidden chambers beneath the palace. Their goods were quietly integrated into Ephyra's treasury, their servants given explanations that sent them away believing their masters had simply chosen new routes. The violation of Xenia, the sacred law of hospitality that bound all civilized peoples, represented a crossing of moral boundaries that even Sisyphus's most flexible conscience had once respected. But the practical advantages proved irresistible. A single night's work could yield more treasure than months of careful trading, and the risks seemed manageable as long as the victims were chosen carefully. Travelers without powerful friends, merchants whose roots were unknown to their families, diplomats carrying messages between minor kingdoms. Such people vanished into the foundations of Ephira's growing wealth. The corruption spread beyond simple murder for profit. Sisyphus began to take a darker pleasure in the exercise of absolute power over his victims. In the moment when they realized that their trust in his hospitality had been fatally misplaced, he would engage them in philosophical discussions about the nature of justice and divine law, all while knowing that their deaths had already been decided. The intellectual exercise of justifying his actions to his victims became almost as satisfying as the material gains their deaths provided. Some whispered that Sisyphus possessed supernatural cunning, that he had made bargains with dark powers to enhance his natural gifts. Others suggested he had learned secrets from his divine bride that allowed him to see through mortal deceptions with more than mortal clarity. But those who studied his methods more carefully recognized something more disturbing than supernatural aid. This was simply what human intelligence could accomplish when freed from the restraints of conscience and convention. He respected the gods with proper sacrifice and festival, ensuring that no deity could claim neglect or disrespect. The temples of Ephira were magnificent, their priests well-fed and influential, their ceremonies conducted with meticulous attention to traditional forms. Yet, Sisyphus paid closer attention to divine quarrels and weaknesses than to divine commandments, filing away each piece of celestial gossip like a merchant stores valuable coins. He noted which gods felt slighted by their treatment in other cities, which goddesses nursed ancient grudges, which divine marriages were troubled by infidelity or neglect. The festivals he sponsored were lavish beyond anything the Isthmus had seen before, drawing worshippers and pilgrims from across the Greek world. But they also served as gathering points for information, opportunities to observe the representatives of rival kingdoms, chances to forge new alliances and identify emerging threats. A celebration honoring Poseidon might include prayers for safe voyages, but it also provided opportunities to learn which cities planned new maritime ventures, which trading expeditions were being organized, which naval forces might threaten established routes. As Ephira grew from settlement to city, from city to the jewel of the Isthmus, Sisyphus's reputation spread beyond his borders, like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Merchants spoke of the king who never lost a bargain, who somehow always managed to structure agreements that seemed fair to all parties, while ensuring his own advantage. Diplomats returned from his court with treaties that appeared favorable, until their true implications became clear months or years later, when changed circumstances revealed clauses that had seemed innocuous but proved decisive. Kings who had thought to intimidate the upstart ruler of the Isthmus found themselves somehow in his debt, bound by oaths they had sworn without understanding their full weight. The stories that spread about him took on an almost mythical quality. It was said that he could predict the outcome of negotiations before they began, that he never forgot a debt or a favor, that he possessed maps showing every secret route and hidden harbor between Thessaly and Crete. Merchants claimed he could tell at a glance which ships carried valuable cargo, and which were decoys, which captains could be trusted, and which would turn pirate given sufficient temptation. Soldiers whispered that he knew the deployment of every army in Greece, the loyalty of every garrison commander, the contents of every treasury from Macedonia to the southern islands. Some of these stories were doubtless exaggerated in the telling, but enough truth lay beneath them to give even the most skeptical pause. Sisyphus had built something unprecedented, a kingdom that existed not through the traditional pillars of military might or divine sanction, but through pure information and influence. He commanded no great armies, claimed no descent from the gods, controlled no ancient religious centers, yet his power grew steadily, while kingdoms with far greater apparent advantages found themselves gradually marginalized. Yet it was not merely through trickery that Sisyphus built his power. He possessed a mind that could hold a dozen different schemes in balance, seeing how each piece of the great game might serve his ultimate design. His court became a place where the most complex problems found elegant solutions, where disputes that had festered for generations were resolved through arrangements that seemed impossible until the moment they were proposed. He was genuinely generous to those who served him faithfully, creating a core of loyal followers who understood that their prosperity was bound to his success. He showed mercy to enemies who yielded gracefully, incorporating them into his growing network rather than destroying them outright. But he was also ruthless to those who betrayed him, and his vengeance took forms that served as lessons to others who might contemplate similar betrayals. A merchant who broke a sworn agreement might find his ships mysteriously detained in every harbor he attempted to enter. A diplomat who carried false information might discover that his lies had somehow become known to every court in Greece before he could profit from them. A king who reneged on a treaty might wake to find his enemies inexplicably united against him, their previous conflicts forgotten in favor of a common cause. The genius of such punishment lay not in its severity, but in its apparent naturalness. Sisyphus's enemies rarely suffered obviously supernatural fates that might suggest divine intervention on his behalf. Instead, they found themselves victims of perfectly ordinary misfortunes that happened to occur with suspicious frequency and devastating effect. The appearance of natural consequence made resistance seem futile, while allowing Sisyphus to maintain the facade of innocence that protected him from direct retaliation. While other kings raged and warred and spent their strength in open battle, burning through resources and accumulating enemies with each victory, Sisyphus wove webs of obligation and advantage that grew stronger with each passing season. His patience was legendary and unnerving, for he seemed willing to wait years for the proper moment to collect a debt or settle a score. This quality made him a dangerous enemy and a valuable ally, for those who served his interests knew they could depend upon eventual reward, while those who opposed him understood that no betrayal would be forgotten. The years brought him wealth beyond measure, as trade routes that had operated for generations found themselves redirected through Ephira's markets. The city's harbor became a necessary stop for ships traveling between east and west, its overland routes the preferred path for caravans seeking safe passage through the isthmus. Tribute flowed in from communities that had accepted his protection, fees accumulated from merchants who used his roads and markets, and taxes multiplied as more people chose to live within his realm rather than risk the uncertainties of less well-governed territories. But wealth alone could not satisfy the hunger that drove him. Each success only revealed new possibilities. Each achievement suggested greater ambitions that lay just beyond his current reach. He had proven that a clever man could build a kingdom from nothing, that intelligence properly applied could triumph over traditional advantages of birth, military strength, or divine favor. Yet the very completeness of his earthly success had begun to point his thoughts toward realms that no mortal king had dared to challenge. He sought marriage not for love, though love might come, but for alliance that would lift his line above the petty concerns of mortal kings. His eyes turned skyward, toward the daughters of Atlas who danced among the stars themselves. The Pleiades, those 7 sisters whose light blessed sailors and guided the lost, seemed impossibly distant from a mortal king's reach. Yet distance had never daunted Sisyphus when the prize was worthy of the effort. The courtship of a stellar goddess required delicacy and planning that exceeded even his previous achievements. One could not simply send ambassadors to negotiate with the daughters of Atlas, nor offer conventional bride gifts to beings whose very nature transcended mortal understanding. Instead, Sisyphus embarked upon a campaign of such subtlety that its true purpose remained hidden even from those who helped execute it. He began by establishing himself as a patron of astronomers and stargazers, founding a school at Ephora where scholars could study the movements of celestial bodies without interference from more practical concerns. The knowledge they gathered served his commercial and military purposes, for understanding the stars improved navigation and allowed more precise timing of voyages and campaigns. But it also demonstrated his respect for cosmic order and his appreciation for the divine mathematics that governed the heavens. His festivals grew more elaborate, their timing calculated to coincide with significant stellar events, their ceremonies designed to honor not just the major Olympian deities, but the lesser-known powers that influenced fate and fortune. He commissioned poets to compose hymns celebrating the beauty and wisdom of the star daughters, artists to create images worthy of their celestial nature, architects to design temples that captured and reflected starlight in ways that seemed to bring heaven down to earth. Slowly, carefully, through intermediaries both mortal and divine, he began to make his interest known, not as a demand or even a direct request, but as an expression of admiration that gradually took more concrete form. He offered gifts that demonstrated understanding of what might please a being whose existence spanned cosmic cycles, observatories that would function for centuries, endowments that would support scholarship long after he was gone, festivals that would continue honoring the stars regardless of political changes. Yet distance had never daunted Sisyphus when the prize was worthy of the effort. Through careful negotiation, through offers that touched upon divine vanity and cosmic politics in ways that lesser mortals could never understand, he gradually approached the impossible goal. He learned which of the sisters might be most receptive to mortal attention, which celestial politics might make marriage advantageous, which divine precedents could be cited to make his suit seem less presumptuous. The negotiations took years, conducted through intermediaries who themselves often did not understand the full scope of what they were facilitating. Divine messengers carried carefully crafted proposals between earth and heaven, their contents revealing layers of meaning that demonstrated Sisyphus's understanding of celestial politics. He offered not just conventional bride gifts, but commitments that would bind his city and his bloodline to the service of cosmic order, promises that would make Ephra a permanent bridge between mortal and divine realms. When at last he won the hand of Merope, youngest and most beautiful of the Star Sisters, the achievement stunned even those who had learned to expect the impossible from the king of Ephra. The marriage negotiations had required him to demonstrate not just wealth and power, but wisdom that approached divine understanding, diplomatic skill that could navigate the complex relationships between celestial beings, and vision that extended far beyond mortal lifespans. The marriage was celebrated with festivities that lasted 7 days and nights, their magnificence carefully designed to honor both earthly and heavenly guests. Wine flowed like rivers, but it was wine that had been blessed by priests of 7 different deities and aged in caves where starlight entered through crystal formations. Music filled the air from dawn to dawn, but it was music composed according to mathematical principles that reflected the harmony of celestial spheres, performed by musicians who had studied under masters in distant temples. Representatives came from every major kingdom in the Greek world, for none dared refuse an invitation to witness such an unprecedented event. Kings who had viewed Sisyphus as an upstart competitor found themselves in the position of paying homage to a mortal who had accomplished what none of their lineages had ever approached. The marriage made political statements that would echo for generations, establishing Ephra as a power that transcended normal categories of mortal authority. But the celebration was more than political theater. Those who attended later claimed they had witnessed magic that night, as starlight seemed to gather more thickly around the bride and groom, as music achieved harmonies that touched something deeper than earthly emotion, as the very air shimmered with possibilities that transcended ordinary experience. Whether through divine blessing or supernatural influence, the marriage ceremony transformed both participants, binding them together in ways that created something new under the heavens. But those who knew the ancient lore whispered that Merope's star would shine dimmer than her sister's for her choice to wed a mortal, as though the heavens themselves mourned what they saw as a diminishment. The whispers suggested that divine blood, when mixed with mortal ambition, created combinations that troubled the cosmic order. Offspring who might inherit powers they were not meant to possess, destinies that could not be contained within the normal boundaries of human existence. Sisyphus cared nothing for such whispers, or perhaps he understood their true significance better than the whisperers themselves realized. He had bound himself to divinity itself, achieving something that placed him beyond the normal categories of mortal kingship. From that union came children who carried both mortal ambition and stellar fire in their veins. Offspring whose very existence testified to their father's ability to transcend the limitations that constrained other men. His son Glaucus grew to manhood marked by intelligence that sometimes seemed to approach prophecy, able to read patterns in nature and human behavior that escaped ordinary observation. Through Glaucus would come Bellerophon, the hero who would tame Pegasus and slay the Chimera, deeds that required both mortal courage and something approaching divine insight. Sisyphus's line would spread across the Greek world, carrying forward a legacy that combined earthly cunning with celestial vision, creating descendants who would be remembered in song and story long after empires fell. His other children, too, showed signs of their mixed heritage, exhibiting gifts that marked them as something more than ordinary princes and princesses. They moved through the world with confidence that suggested they understood secrets hidden from others, spoke with wisdom that seemed drawn from sources beyond normal education, formed alliances, and achieved successes that consistently exceeded what birth and training alone could explain. The king himself found that marriage to a stellar goddess had changed him in ways that became apparent only gradually. His understanding of political currents deepened, as though he could perceive the larger patterns that shaped human events. His ability to predict the consequences of decisions improved, allowing him to structure agreements and alliances with even greater precision. Most significantly, his sense of what was possible expanded, as constant exposure to divine thinking stretched his conception of the boundaries that limited mortal achievement. His name would be remembered long after the stones of Ephora had crumbled to dust, carved into the genealogies of heroes, and whispered in the council chambers of kings who sought to understand how one man had achieved so much. Yet even as he celebrated his triumph, even as he watched his city rise in splendor, and his influence spread like ripples from a stone cast into still water, something darker grew within the king's heart. Success bred appetite, and appetite bred the dangerous belief that he who had outwitted men might also outwit gods. The marriage to Merope had given him unprecedented access to divine society, opportunities to observe the Olympians at close range during festivals and family gatherings. What he saw there both reassured and disturbed him. The gods were indeed powerful beyond mortal comprehension, capable of reshaping reality with casual gestures, commanding forces that could level mountains or alter the courses of rivers. Ra had crumbled to dust. Yet even as he celebrated his triumph, even as he watched his city rise in splendor, and his influence spread like ripples from a stone cast into still water, something darker grew within the king's heart. Success bred appetite, and appetite bred the dangerous belief that he who had outwitted men might also outwit gods. Sisyphus began to notice things that other mortals overlooked, how Zeus's attention wandered during festivals, how the god-king's lusts led him into compromising situations, how divine quarrels created opportunities for clever mortals to profit. He filed these observations away as carefully as he stored grain against winter, not yet knowing how dearly such knowledge would cost. The city of Ephyra flourished under his rule, its harbors filled with ships from every corner of the known world, its markets rich with goods that spanned from amber of the distant north to spices of the far south. Sisyphus had achieved what few mortals even dared to dream. He had built something lasting, something magnificent, something that would endure long after his mortal form had returned to dust. His throne sat secure, his treasury overflowed, his family was blessed by divine blood, and his reputation for wisdom and cunning spread to every court in the Greek world. But in the depths of his satisfaction, in the very completeness of his earthly triumph, lay the seeds of a hubris that would shake the foundations of heaven itself. For Sisyphus had begun to believe that his cleverness was not merely a gift, but a power that placed him beyond the reach of consequence. He had tricked merchants and kings, had negotiated with river gods and won the hand of a stellar goddess, had built a city that rivaled the greatest settlements of the ancient world. What, he began to wonder in the dangerous privacy of his thoughts, might prevent him from matching wits with the highest powers of all? The question took root in his mind, like a seed planted in fertile soil, growing stronger with each passing day, each new success, each moment when his cleverness proved superior to the conventional wisdom of his time. He did not yet know that some questions, once asked, demand answers that reshape the very cosmos to provide them. He did not yet understand that the gods, who had watched his rise with amusement, were beginning to take notice of the mortal king, who seemed to believe himself beyond the reach of divine justice. He could not foresee that his greatest triumph was about to become the foundation of his most terrible downfall. But in the warm evening air of Ephyra, as he stood upon his palace balcony and looked out over the city he had built from nothing but ambition and wit, Sisyphus felt only the satisfaction of a man who had seized destiny by the throat and bent it to his will. The stars wheeled overhead, including the dimmed light of his wife's celestial home, and the king of Ephyra smiled to think that he had reached so high and grasped so much. Below him, the city settled into evening's peace, its citizens secure in their prosperity, unaware that their king's thoughts were turning toward questions that would soon draw the attention of powers beyond mortal understanding. In the growing darkness, Sisyphus planned new schemes, considered new possibilities, and dreamed dreams of cleverness that would eclipse even his greatest achievements. The age of consequences had not yet begun. Act 2. The Great Deception. The morning that would seal Sisyphus's fate dawned clear and bright over Ephyra, with no hint of the divine drama that was about to unfold across the heavens. The king rose early, as was his custom, to walk the battlements of his palace and survey the realm that his cunning had built from nothing. Below him, the harbor stirred to life as merchants prepared their ships for the day's voyages, traders arranged their wares in the marketplace, and the complex machinery of commerce that he had so carefully constructed began its daily operation. From his elevated vantage point, Sisyphus could see far across the waters that separated his isthmus from the islands and distant shores where other kingdoms pursued their more conventional forms of power. The sight filled him with the familiar satisfaction of a man who had chosen his ground wisely, who had built something that would endure long after the military conquests of his contemporaries had crumbled to dust. Yet on this particular morning, something caught his attention that would transform satisfaction into opportunity, and opportunity into the seeds of divine retribution. A disturbance in the air above the eastern waters drew his gaze skyward, where the clear blue of dawn was suddenly broken by clouds that moved against the wind, forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their arrangement. As he watched, the clouds darkened and began to spiral, creating a vortex that descended toward the earth, with purpose that spoke of divine intervention rather than natural weather. Thunder rumbled without lightning, and the very air seemed to thicken with the presence of power that transcended mortal understanding. Then, through the swirling darkness, Sisyphus glimpsed something that made his breath catch in recognition and calculation. Zeus himself materialized from the storm, his form magnificent and terrible even at this distance, bearing in his arms a figure that struggled against divine strength, with the futility of mortal flesh opposing cosmic force. The abduction was swift, almost casual in its execution, yet Sisyphus's trained eye caught details that others would have missed in the brief span of the god's manifestation. The victim was young, beautiful, and clearly of divine or semi-divine heritage, for her struggles sent ripples of power through the air that ordinary mortals could never have generated. Her cries carried across the water with clarity that suggested supernatural acoustics. And in those cries, Sisyphus heard not just fear, but outrage, the indignation of one accustomed to reverence, who found herself subjected to treatment that violated every principle of proper conduct between divine beings. As quickly as it had begun, the abduction ended. Zeus and his captive vanished into a second vortex of cloud and lightning, leaving behind only the gradually clearing sky and the distant echo of divine voices raised in passion and protest. To most observers, the event would have seemed like a brief storm, perhaps touched with divine presence, but ultimately beyond mortal concern. But Sisyphus was not most observers, and his mind was already working through the implications of what he had witnessed. Years of marriage to Merope had given him extensive knowledge of divine genealogies and politics, information that proved invaluable as he considered the identity of Zeus's latest victim. The combination of beauty, power, and the particular quality of her resistance suggested one of the river daughters, those semi-divine beings who inherited both divine beauty and the fierce independence that came from ruling their own aquatic domains. If his guess was correct, this was Aegina, daughter of the river god Sisyphus, whose domain lay not far from the very waters where the abduction had occurred. The realization sent a thrill of possibility through Sisyphus that he recognized as both opportunity and danger. Sisyphus was not merely any river god, but one of the most powerful, his waters feeding the lands of multiple kingdoms, his favor essential to the prosperity of countless communities. More importantly, Sisyphus was known for his fierce protection of his daughters and his willingness to pursue vengeance against those who wronged his family, regardless of their divine status. If Zeus had indeed taken Aegina, the river god would be seeking answers, and answers were something that Sisyphus was uniquely positioned to provide. But knowledge was only valuable if it could be transformed into advantage, and advantage required careful timing and perfect execution. Sisyphus descended from his battlements with the measured pace of a man whose thoughts were moving far faster than his feet, already formulating the approach that would turn divine indiscretion into mortal profit. The plan that began to form in his mind was audacious, even by his standards, requiring him to insert himself into a conflict between powers that could crush him without effort if his calculations proved wrong. Yet the potential rewards seemed to justify the risks. Ephora had prospered magnificently under his rule, but it still depended upon sources of fresh water that lay beyond his direct control. The streams and springs that fed his city were adequate for current needs, but would prove insufficient if the population continued to grow at its present rate. What he needed was a permanent water source, something that would guarantee his city's prosperity for generations to come, independent of the political arrangements that currently governed access to existing supplies. Sisyphus, in his grief and rage, might be willing to grant such a boon in exchange for information that would allow him to confront his daughter's abductor. The river god's power was vast enough to create new springs, to redirect existing waters, to provide Ephora with the kind of permanent abundance that would cement its position as the greatest trading center in the Greek world. All that was required was the courage to approach a grieving father and the skill to negotiate with divine wrath. The risks were enormous. Zeus's anger, if discovered, would be terrible beyond description. The king of gods did not tolerate interference in his personal affairs, and mortals who involved themselves in divine politics rarely survived the experience. But Sisyphus had built his entire career on calculated risks, on his ability to see opportunities that others missed, and to execute plans that others would consider impossible. His marriage to Merope had given him insights into divine psychology that few mortals possessed, and his years of studying Olympian politics had taught him that even gods could be predicted and manipulated if one understood their motivations. As the day progressed, Sisyphus made his preparations with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized all his greatest successes. He consulted the ancient texts that described proper protocols for approaching river gods, ensuring that his eventual meeting with Sisyphus would follow forms that would minimize the risk of immediate destruction. He selected gifts appropriate for such an encounter, items that would demonstrate respect without suggesting weakness, offerings that would open negotiations without implying subservience. Most importantly, he spent time refining his approach, considering every possible response that Sisyphus might make and preparing counter-arguments that would guide the conversation toward his desired outcome. The key was to present himself not as a mortal seeking divine favor, but as an ally offering valuable intelligence in exchange for mutual benefit. He would position the water rights not as a tribute demanded by an inferior, but as a fair payment for services rendered, a business transaction between equals, despite the vast difference in their essential natures. By evening, his plans were complete, and Sisyphus set out from Ephyra under cover of darkness, traveling by routes known only to himself, toward the sacred groves where Sisyphus held court among his tributary streams. The journey required him to pass through territories controlled by other powers, but his reputation and the careful neutrality he had maintained in regional conflicts ensured safe passage. No king in the Greek world wished to earn the enmity of the master of Ephyra, whose economic influence could make or break the prosperity of entire regions. The sacred grove of Sisyphus lay hidden in a valley where multiple streams converged, their waters forming pools that reflected starlight with unnatural clarity. Ancient trees stood sentinel around the space, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural cathedral where the voice of the river god could speak without fear of divine eavesdropping. As Sisyphus approached the central pool, the water began to stir with movements that had nothing to do with wind or current, and a presence that pressed against his consciousness with the weight of geological ages made itself known. Sisyphus manifested not as a human figure, but as a living embodiment of water itself, his form shifting between liquid and solidity, his voice carrying the sound of rapids and waterfalls as he spoke. The grief in that voice was unmistakable, a parent's anguish that resonated through the grove like the mourning of the earth itself. When the river god became aware of the mortal presence in his sacred space, the water darkened with suspicion and barely contained rage. What mortal dares approach Sisyphus in his hour of loss? The voice thundered from every stream and pool, creating harmonics that made the very ground tremble beneath Sisyphus's feet. Have you come to mock the grief of a father, or do you seek to profit from the suffering of the innocent? Speak quickly, child of clay, before I wash your presumption into the sea. Sisyphus had prepared for this moment through years of studying divine psychology, and he knew that his first words would determine whether he left this grove alive or became another cautionary tale about mortal presumption. He straightened to his full height, drawing upon the confidence that had carried him through 100 dangerous negotiations, and spoke with the measured cadence of one who brought valuable intelligence rather than empty condolences. Great Sisyphus, Lord of waters that feed the earth and give life to nations, I come not as a supplicant seeking unearned favor, but as one who possesses knowledge that you require to reclaim what has been stolen from you. Your daughter Aegina has been taken, and I alone among mortals witnessed her abduction. I know who has committed this crime, where she has been taken, and what must be done to bring justice to the one who dared violate the sanctity of your family. The water around Sisyphus grew still with supernatural quiet, as though the very streams held their breath, waiting for his next words. In that silence, he could feel the immense power of the river god focusing upon him, assessing his words for truth or deception, measuring his worth as a potential ally or enemy. The moment stretched beyond normal time, filled with currents of divine thought that touched the edges of his consciousness without quite overwhelming his mortal awareness. You claim knowledge of my daughter's fate, Sisyphus said at last, his voice now carrying undertones of hope mixed with warning. Yet knowledge has value, and value demands payment. What price do you set upon this intelligence, mortal king? What do you seek in exchange for revealing the location of my stolen child? Here was the crucial moment, the point where success or failure would be determined by his ability to present his request in terms that would seem reasonable to a grieving father desperate for information. Sisyphus chose his words with the precision of a craftsman setting precious stones, each phrase calculated to advance his cause while appearing to serve the river god's interests. Mighty Sisyphus, my city of Ephyra has prospered through trade and wisdom, becoming a beacon of civilization in these turbulent times. Yet prosperity brings growth, and growth requires resources that my current lands cannot fully provide. What I seek is not tribute or charity, but fair payment for valuable services. A spring of fresh water that will flow perpetually in Ephyra, ensuring that my people can continue to serve as peaceful mediators between the kingdoms of Greece. The request was presented as mutual benefit rather than one-sided advantage, positioning Ephyra's continued prosperity as something that would serve the wider Greek world rather than merely enriching Sisyphus himself. It was the kind of sophisticated manipulation that had made him legendary among diplomats, offering something the river god wanted while framing his own desires as serving a greater good. Sisyphus considered the proposal with the deliberation of one whose decisions shaped the landscape itself. The streams around the grove whispered among themselves in languages older than human speech, carrying the river god's thoughts through currents that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. Finally, after what seemed like hours, but may have been mere moments, the divine presence focused once again upon the mortal who waited with carefully controlled patience. Your proposal has merit, Sisyphus of Ephyra, the river god said, his voice now carrying notes of calculation that matched the mortal's own. A permanent spring is no small gift, yet the recovery of my daughter is worth any price within my power to grant. Tell me what you know of Aegina's abduction, provide proof that your intelligence is accurate, and the waters of Sisyphus shall flow in your city until the end of time itself." This was the moment toward which all of Sisyphus's planning had been directed, the point where divine politics and mortal ambition would intersect in ways that would reshape the balance of power throughout the Greek world. He drew a deep breath, knowing that his next words would irrevocably commit him to a course of action that would make him either the most successful king in mortal history or the most notorious traitor to divine authority. "Great Sisyphus," he began, his voice carrying across the sacred waters with clarity that seemed to resonate from the stones themselves. "I witnessed your daughter's abduction from the battlements of my own palace. The one who took her came clothed in storm clouds and wielding lightning, his power unmistakable to any who have studied the ways of the Olympians. Zeus himself has stolen Aegina, carrying her away to an island refuge where he believes himself safe from discovery or retribution." The revelation struck the grove like a physical blow, causing the streams to surge and the ancient trees to groan as though struck by hurricane winds. The rage of Sisyphus, when it finally erupted, transformed the peaceful valley into a landscape of supernatural fury, with waterspouts rising from every pool and torrents cascading from heights where no water had flowed moments before. The very air became thick with moisture as the river god's emotion manifested in alterations to the natural world that would have terrified anyone with less steel in their spine than Sisyphus possessed. Zeus! The name thundered through the valley with such force that distant mountains echoed the cry, carrying Sisyphus's wrath across leagues of intervening territory. The king of gods has made himself a common kidnapper, stealing daughters as though they were mere mortals, without divine protection. This insult demands answer. This crime requires punishment that will shake Olympus itself. But even as his rage reached its peak, the river god's strategic mind began to reassert itself, for divine anger without direction was merely destructive force wasted on empty air. As the supernatural storm gradually subsided, Sisyphus turned his attention back to the mortal, whose information had revealed both the magnitude of the crime and the identity of the criminal. "You have spoken truth, Sisyphus of Ephyra, and truth deserves the reward I promised. But tell me this, where has Zeus taken my daughter? Knowledge of the crime means nothing without knowledge of where justice can be pursued." Here Sisyphus revealed the full extent of his preparation, for he had spent the hours since witnessing the abduction in careful research and deduction. His marriage to Merope had given him access to stellar knowledge that included the movements of islands and the seasonal patterns of divine travel. Cross-referencing this information with the direction Zeus had taken and the timing of the abduction, he had narrowed the possibilities to a handful of locations that met the god-king's requirements for secluded romance. The island of Oenone, Sisyphus replied with the confidence of one whose intelligence networks spanned the known world, lies in the eastern waters where Zeus maintains a private retreat for his mortal liaisons. It is there that he has taken Aegina, believing himself protected by distance and divine prerogative from the consequences of his actions. The accuracy of this information would become apparent within hours, as Sisyphus departed immediately to confront his daughter's abductor, leaving behind the promised spring that would flow in Ephyra until the end of time. The new water source bubbled up from depths that seemed to reach the very foundations of the earth, emerging clear and sweet in the heart of the city, a permanent testament to Sisyphus's ability to turn divine drama into mortal advantage. But as Sisyphus returned to his palace in triumph, enjoying the satisfaction of another successful negotiation, he remained unaware that his actions had already set in motion consequences that would soon transform his greatest success into the foundation of his ultimate downfall. On distant Olympus, Zeus had felt the approach of Aesopus's wrath and quickly deduced the source of information that had made such pursuit possible. The king of gods was not accustomed to having his private affairs exposed by mortal intelligence, and his anger at this unprecedented breach of divine privacy would soon manifest in ways that Sisyphus's careful calculations had failed to anticipate. The water that now flowed in Ephyra would indeed run until the end of time, but the man who had secured it would discover that some bargains carried prices that no amount of cleverness could avoid paying. The morning after his meeting with Aesopus, Sisyphus woke to find his city transformed by the presence of its new water source. Citizens gathered around the spring in wonder and celebration, understanding that this gift would secure their prosperity for generations to come. Merchants arriving for the day's trading spoke excitedly of the news spreading throughout the Greek world. Ephyra now possessed water rights that would make it independent of any external political arrangements, a resource that would draw trade and settlement from across the known world. Yet even as he basked in the immediate success of his gambit, Sisyphus could not entirely silence the small voice of caution that had served him well throughout his career. He had committed an act of unprecedented audacity, inserting himself into a conflict between the king of gods and a powerful river deity, profiting from information that Zeus clearly considered private. The immediate rewards were substantial, but the long-term consequences remained to be seen. His concerns proved prophetic with terrifying swiftness. As the sun reached its zenith, the clear sky above Ephyra began to darken with clouds that formed too quickly and moved too purposefully to be natural weather. Thunder rumbled with rhythms that spoke of divine anger rather than atmospheric disturbance, and the very air grew thick with the kind of supernatural tension that preceded the manifestation of Olympian power. From his palace battlements, Sisyphus watched the approaching storm with the grim fascination of one who recognizes that his carefully calculated risks have finally encountered consequences beyond his ability to control. The clouds above were not merely dark, but shot through with lightning that moved in patterns too complex for natural electricity, forming symbols and signs that spelled out divine displeasure in languages older than human civilization. As the supernatural tempest reached the city's borders, a figure materialized from its depths that struck terror into every mortal heart that witnessed its approach. This was not Zeus in his aspect as king of gods, magnificent and terrible, but recognizably divine. This was Thanatos himself, death personified, the inexorable force that claimed every mortal life and whose approach no earthly power could prevent or delay. Death came to Ephyra clothed in darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than merely blocking it, his presence turning the noon sun pale and ineffective. Where his feet touched the earth, plants withered and stones cracked, as though the very substance of the mortal world could not bear contact with such absolute finality. His face, when it could be glimpsed beneath the shadows that clung to him like living garments, bore the terrible beauty of endings. The peace came only when all struggles had been concluded and all accounts finally settled. The citizens of Ephyra fled before his approach, understanding with instinctive terror that they stood in the presence of the one force that no mortal cleverness could outwit, no earthly power could resist. Markets emptied as merchants abandoned their goods. Children were swept up by parents who ran without looking back, and even the bravest warriors found reasons to be elsewhere when death walked the streets of their city. But Sisyphus did not flee. Standing alone on his palace battlements, watching the approach of the most feared figure in the mortal cosmos, he felt not terror, but a strange combination of resignation and curiosity. He had always known that his games with divine politics carried ultimate risks, and if those risks had finally come to claim their price, he would meet them with the same cold calculation that had carried him through every previous crisis. As Thanatos reached the palace gates, Sisyphus descended from his elevated position to meet his visitor in the great hall where he had received so many guests over the years. The irony was not lost on him that death would come to claim him in the same space where he had murdered countless travelers, violated the sacred laws of hospitality, and planned the schemes that had made him both legendary and infamous throughout the Greek world. The great hall had been cleared by servants who possessed enough sense to absent themselves when divine justice came calling, leaving only the king and his supernatural visitor in a space that suddenly seemed vast and empty despite its familiar dimensions. Torches flickered weakly in the presence of absolute darkness, their flames struggling against shadows that pressed in from all directions, seeking to extinguish every source of light and warmth. Thanatos spoke with a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carrying the finality of closing doors and the silence of ended conversations. Sisyphus, king of Ephyra, your cleverness has at last exceeded the bounds of divine patience. Zeus, whose private affairs you have made public, has decreed that your mortal existence shall end this day. Come, accept the chains that will bind you for the journey to Hades, where your crimes will receive their proper judgment. The moment had arrived toward which all of Sisyphus's life had been building, the final test of whether mortal intelligence could triumph over cosmic force. As he looked upon the figure of death himself, feeling the weight of inevitability that pressed down upon every living thing, Sisyphus experienced a moment of clarity that revealed both the magnitude of his achievements and the ultimate futility of his resistance to divine will. Yet even in that moment of supreme crisis, his mind continued to work with the cold precision that had made him legendary. If death had come to claim him, then death was present in his hall, subject to the same laws of physics and magic that governed all manifestations in the mortal world. And if death could be present, then death could potentially be influenced, manipulated, perhaps even defeated by one who possessed sufficient understanding of the forces involved. The chains that Thanatos carried gleamed with supernatural light, their metal forged in the deepest furnaces of the underworld, designed to bind even the most powerful spirits and drag them down to face divine judgment. But chains, however supernatural their origin, still functioned according to principles that a clever man might understand and exploit. As Sisyphus looked upon the instruments of his intended captivity, a plan began to form in his mind that was audacious even by his own extraordinary standards. "Mighty Thanatos," he said, his voice carrying the same respectful tone he had used when addressing Asopus. "I do not dispute Zeus's right to claim my life, nor do I question your authority to carry out his will. Yet before I submit to these bonds, might I ask a favor born of curiosity rather than resistance? These chains are clearly artifacts of divine craftsmanship, and I confess myself fascinated by their construction. Would you honor a condemned man's final request by demonstrating how they function?" The request seemed innocent enough, the natural curiosity of a man known throughout the Greek world for his interest in understanding how things worked. Death himself, secure in his power, and perhaps even slightly amused by the mortal's scholarly interest, saw no harm in satisfying such a harmless request. After all, what threat could a mere king pose to the personification of universal mortality? "Very well," Thanatos replied, his voice carrying the patience of one who had all eternity to complete his tasks. "These chains are wrought from metals that exist only in the underworld, tempered in fires that burn without consuming, designed to hold even the mightiest spirits until they accept their fate. Observe how they close around the wrists of their victim, forming bonds that no earthly force can break." As Death reached forward to demonstrate the mechanism that would seal Sisyphus's fate, the king of Ephyra moved with speed that surprised even himself, his hands grasping the supernatural chains at the precise moment when they were most vulnerable to misdirection. The motion was complex, requiring split-second timing and understanding of mechanical principles that few mortals could have grasped. But Sisyphus had spent years studying the behavior of complex systems under stress. The result was a reversal that stunned both participants in the encounter. Instead of closing around Sisyphus's wrists, the divine chains snapped shut around those of Thanatos himself, their supernatural mechanism, triggered by the very demonstration that was meant to show their power. Death found himself bound by the instruments of his own authority, trapped by chains that had never been designed to hold their wielder. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond normal time, Thanatos stared at his bound hands with something approaching disbelief, as though the fundamental laws of existence had suddenly reversed themselves without warning. Then the implications of what had occurred began to register, and with them came a rage that shook the very foundations of the mortal world. "Impossible!" The word exploded from Death's lips with force that shattered windows throughout the palace and sent cracks racing through stones that had stood for decades. "No mortal can bind death. No earthly power can chain the inevitable. Release me immediately, or face punishments that will make divine wrath seem like gentle chastisement." But Sisyphus had not committed the most audacious act in mortal history, only to surrender its advantages at the first sign of supernatural anger. Moving quickly, he secured the chains to iron rings set deep in the palace foundations, bonds that had been designed to hold prisoners, but now served to restrain the most powerful force in the cosmos. Only when Death was securely fastened did he step back to consider the full implications of what he had accomplished. "Forgive me, mighty Thanatos," he said with mock courtesy that barely concealed his triumphant satisfaction. "But I find myself reluctant to embrace an ending to my story when so many interesting chapters remain to be written. Perhaps you would be so kind as to remain my guest while I consider how best to resolve this situation to everyone's satisfaction." The binding of death sent ripples through the fabric of reality that were felt immediately across the mortal world. In battlefields where armies clashed with deadly intent, soldiers found themselves unable to die, despite wounds that should have been instantly fatal. Plague victims lingered in suffering that stretched beyond endurance, their bodies unable to find the release that death had always provided. Elderly citizens who had prayed for peaceful endings discovered that age no longer led to its natural conclusion, creating a world where the normal cycles of existence had been suspended by one man's desperate cleverness. As news of the world's transformation spread, reaching first the neighboring kingdoms and then expanding across the known world, the implications of Sisyphus's action became clear to divine and mortal observers alike. He had not merely delayed his own death, but fundamentally altered the operation of cosmic law, creating a situation that threatened the stability of existence itself. On Olympus, the gods gathered in emergency council to address a crisis unlike any they had previously faced. Zeus's anger at his private affairs being exposed now seemed trivial compared to the threat posed by a mortal who had actually succeeded in capturing death itself. If Thanatos remained bound, the natural order would collapse, creating chaos that could destroy the carefully maintained balance between divine and mortal realms. Yet even as divine anger mounted toward levels that threatened to tear the sky apart, there remained the problem of how to address a situation that defied all precedent. No mortal had ever accomplished anything comparable to binding death, and the usual methods of divine retribution seemed inadequate to deal with consequences of such magnitude. The answer came from an unexpected source: Ares, god of war, whose domain had been most immediately affected by the cessation of death in battle. If warriors could not die, then war lost its meaning. Conflict became mere exercise, and the very essence of martial honor was corrupted by the absence of ultimate consequence. The war god's rage at this perversion of his sphere provided the motivation needed to take direct action against the mortal who had dared disrupt cosmic order. Ares descended to earth with none of Zeus's subtlety or Thanatos's inevitability, but with raw divine fury that brooked no resistance and acknowledged no clever schemes. He manifested in Ephira as a force of pure destruction, his presence turning the air itself into something that burned mortal lungs and made the ground tremble beneath feet that could no longer find secure purchase. The god of war wasted no time on conversation or negotiation. With strength that could shatter mountains and speed that outpaced thought itself, he broke into the palace where Sisyphus held death captive, shattered the chains that bound Thanatos with contemptuous ease, and seized the mortal king before any escape could be attempted. "Your cleverness ends here, fool," Ares declared, his voice carrying the sound of armies in battle and cities burning under siege. "Death shall have his due, and you shall learn that some forces cannot be cheated, regardless of mortal ingenuity." The liberation of Thanatos restored the natural order with dramatic swiftness. Across the world, those who had been suspended between life and death found release, the wounded died with their proper dignity, and the elderly passed peacefully into whatever realms awaited beyond mortal existence. The cosmic balance reasserted itself as death resumed his eternal duties. though not without casting looks of deep resentment toward the mortal who had subjected him to unprecedented humiliation. As Ares prepared to deliver Sisyphus to his long-delayed fate, dragging the king of Ephyra toward the gates of Hades, where proper judgment awaited, it seemed that the most audacious gambit in mortal history had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. The man who had tried to outwit death itself was about to discover that some victories were too dangerous to achieve, some successes too costly to survive. The journey to the underworld began with a descent that defied mortal understanding of geography and physics. Ares, his grip upon Sisyphus's arm like iron bands heated in divine forges, strode through spaces that existed between the normal dimensions of the living world. The earth opened before them, not as a cave or chasm, but as a pathway that led downward through layers of reality that no mortal eye had been meant to see. The first boundary they crossed was that between day and night eternal. Above them, the familiar sky of the mortal world faded into memory, replaced by a dome of darkness shot through with lights that were not stars, but the distant gleams of divine powers pursuing their eternal tasks. The air grew thick and still, carrying scents of earth and time and endings that spoke of realms where the normal cycles of existence held no sway. As they descended deeper, the very substance of the world around them began to change. Stone became something more than stone, imbued with the weight of countless ages and the pressure of divine authority. Water, where it appeared, flowed upward as often as down, defying the laws that governed surface streams, while following currents of supernatural force that shaped the underworld's geography, according to cosmic rather than earthly principles. The path they followed was ancient beyond mortal reckoning, worn smooth by the passage of countless souls, making their final journey from life into whatever realms awaited beyond death's threshold. Yet, despite its antiquity, every step revealed details that spoke of divine craftsmanship. Stones fitted together with precision that exceeded mortal architecture, passages carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when observed directly, chambers that opened into vistas that should have been impossible given the confines of underground space. Sisyphus, despite the circumstances of his journey, found himself studying these marvels with the same analytical attention he had applied to every other challenge throughout his life. Even facing divine judgment, even bound by Ares's inescapable grip, his mind continued to catalog information, seeking patterns and possibilities that might yet serve his purposes. The underworld was clearly not simply a place, but a system, governed by rules that could potentially be understood and therefore manipulated by one clever enough to discern their operation. The first guardian they encountered was Cerberus, the three-headed hound, whose duty was to prevent the living from entering the realm of the dead, and the dead from departing without proper authorization. The massive creature, each of its heads larger than a mortal horse, regarded their approach with eyes that glowed like coals in the supernatural darkness. Yet when the beast recognized Ares and the divine authority he represented, it stepped aside with something approaching respectful acknowledgement, allowing them to pass without challenge. Beyond Cerberus lay the river Styx, whose dark waters formed the final boundary between the world of the living and the kingdom of the dead. The ferryman Charon waited at his dock with the patience of one whose duties had no beginning and would have no end, his ancient face expressing neither welcome nor hostility, toward the latest souls to require passage to the far shore. Another king comes to Hades, Charon observed, his voice carrying the dry humor of one who had witnessed the humbling of countless rulers. They always arrive with such confidence, such certainty, that their earthly achievements will count for something in the realm where all accounts are finally settled. Tell me, Ares, does this one believe himself different from the others? The war god's laughter rumbled like distant thunder across the dark waters. This one bound death itself, ferryman. If any mortal might prove different, it would be Sisyphus of Ephyra. Yet difference and success are not the same thing, as he shall soon discover. The crossing of Styx was accomplished in silence, the boat moving through waters that reflected no light and created no wake, propelled by forces that had nothing to do with current or wind. As they traveled, Sisyphus observed the geography of Hades unfolding around them. Vast plains, where the spirits of the ordinary dead wandered in endless twilight. Mountains that rose toward ceilings of living rock. Rivers that flowed through landscapes of shadow and memory. The palace of Hades rose before them, like a mountain carved from obsidian and night, its towers reaching toward heights that disappeared into supernatural darkness, its walls reflecting the dim light of the underworld in patterns that seemed to shift and change with each viewing. This was the seat of power in the realm of the dead, the court where final judgments were rendered, and eternal fates decided by authorities whose wisdom exceeded mortal comprehension. As they approached the great gates of the palace, Sisyphus felt the weight of countless ages pressing down upon his consciousness. This was where his journey from ambitious prince to legendary king to divine prisoner would reach its conclusion, where the cleverness that had served him so well in the mortal world would face its ultimate test against powers that had governed existence since the dawn of time. The gates opened at their approach, revealing the throne room of Hades in all its terrible majesty. The chamber was vast beyond mortal architecture, its ceiling lost in darkness that seemed to absorb, rather than merely reflect, the light of torches that burned with flames of blue and silver. The throne itself was carved from a single block of some mineral that existed nowhere in the upper world, dark as midnight, yet shot through with veins of luminescence that pulsed with the rhythm of cosmic heartbeats. Upon the throne sat Hades himself, lord of the dead and ruler of the underworld, his presence both terrible and magnificent. Beside him stood Persephone, queen of the dead, her beauty unmarked by the darkness that surrounded her, her eyes holding depths that spoke of wisdom, earned through suffering and authority, accepted through sacrifice. These were the powers before whom Sisyphus would soon stand trial, the judges who would determine whether his crimes merited special punishment or merely the common fate of ordinary shades. Ares brought his prisoner forward with the satisfaction of one who had successfully completed a difficult task, presenting Sisyphus to the rulers of the underworld like a general displaying captured enemy standards to his sovereign. The war god's voice echoed through the vast chamber as he made his report to those whose authority exceeded even his own. Great Hades, Queen Persephone, I present to you Sisyphus of Ephyra, who dared bind death itself and disrupt the natural order of existence. Zeus has decreed that this mortal's crimes merit judgment in your court, and I have brought him here to face whatever punishment divine justice deems appropriate. As Ares spoke, Sisyphus felt the full weight of divine attention settling upon him like a physical force. The eyes of Hades measured him with the dispassion of one who had seen every form of mortal folly, while Persephone's gaze seemed to pierce through to the depths of his soul, reading there the full catalogue of his achievements and crimes. For the first time since his capture, Sisyphus experienced something approaching genuine fear, not of death, but of judgment, by powers whose understanding exceeded his ability to predict or manipulate. Yet even in that moment of supreme crisis, even as he stood before the throne of ultimate authority in the realm of the dead, his mind continued to work with the relentless precision that had defined his entire existence. He had lost this battle, but the war between mortal cleverness and cosmic authority was not yet over. Deep in the chambers of his scheming heart, new plans were already beginning to form, strategies that would require him to embrace death in order to transcend it, to accept defeat as the foundation of ultimate victory. The king of Ephyra had learned that death could be bound, that the gods themselves were subject to manipulation by those clever enough to understand their weaknesses. Soon, very soon, he would discover just how much that knowledge was worth when applied with the desperate ingenuity of a man who had nothing left to lose but everything still to gain. Act 3. The Eternal Consequence. In the throne room of Hades, where shadows gathered like living things and time moved according to laws that bore no resemblance to mortal chronology, Sisyphus stood before powers that had governed the cosmos since its first dawn. The silence that filled the vast chamber was not merely an absence of sound, but a presence unto itself, weighted with the accumulated judgments of ages and the finality that awaited all mortal striving. Hades himself studied the prisoner with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, measuring the worth of yet another king who believed himself exempt from the common fate of humanity. The Lord of the Dead had seen countless rulers arrive in his realm, each convinced that earthly achievements would translate into special consideration in the afterlife, each discovering that death rendered all mortal distinctions meaningless. Sisyphus of Ephyra, the god's voice resonated through the chamber like the settling of mountains. You stand accused of crimes that exceed the normal bounds of mortal transgression. You have betrayed divine confidences, violated the sacred laws of hospitality, and bound death himself in chains that disrupted the fundamental order of existence. How do you answer these charges? For a moment that seemed to stretch across eons, Sisyphus remained silent, his mind working with the desperate precision of one who faced absolute judgment. Everything he had built, everything he had achieved, everything he had learned through decades of careful observation and manipulation had led to this moment. The skills that had made him legendary among mortals seemed pathetically inadequate when measured against the cosmic authority that surrounded him. Yet, even in the depths of his apparent helplessness, Sisyphus recognized that he retained one advantage that neither divine power nor supernatural wisdom could entirely negate: his understanding of psychology, mortal and immortal alike. The gods, for all their might, remained subject to the same emotional currents that drove human behavior. They could be flattered, convinced, even deceived by one who understood their particular weaknesses and desires. "Great Hades, Queen Persephone," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence that had served him through countless negotiations. I do not dispute the charges brought against me, for I have indeed committed acts that merit divine displeasure. Yet I would ask for the opportunity to explain the circumstances that led to these transgressions, not to excuse them, but to place them in their proper context. The audacity of requesting time to present a defense in the throne room of ultimate judgment would have struck most observers as evidence of madness or supreme arrogance. Yet Sisyphus had built his entire career on calculated risks, and he understood that even divine justice operated according to procedures that clever advocacy might influence. If he could demonstrate remorse, if he could present his crimes as misguided rather than malicious, he might yet escape the worst consequences of his actions. Persephone leaned forward slightly, her interest apparently piqued by the mortal's unexpected approach. The Queen of the Dead had heard countless pleas from souls seeking mercy or clemency, but few had possessed the sophisticated rhetorical skills that Sisyphus displayed even in his extremity. Her voice, when she spoke, carried undertones of curiosity, mixed with the terrible authority of one who ruled over the final destination of all mortal journeys. "Speak then, clever king," she said, the title carrying implications that transcended mere acknowledgement of his earthly rank. "Let us hear how mortal wisdom explains actions that shook the foundations of divine order. But speak quickly, for eternity offers many fates, and few of them reward those who waste our time with empty words." Here was the opening that Sisyphus had hoped to create, the moment when divine attention focused upon his words rather than his crimes. With the skill of a master craftsman shaping precious metal, he began to construct the argument that would either save him or seal his doom forever. "Your Majesties," he said, allowing just the right amount of humility to color his tone, "my crimes began not with malice, but with love. Love for my city, my people, and my family. When I witnessed the abduction of Aegina, I saw not an opportunity for profit, but a father's grief that demanded justice. Sisyphus sought his daughter, and I possessed information that could reunite them. Was it wrong to ease a parent's suffering, even if doing so inadvertently violated divine privacy?" The argument was masterfully constructed, reframing his betrayal of Zeus as an act of compassion rather than calculated treachery. By emphasizing the emotional aspects of the situation while downplaying his material motivations, Sisyphus sought to transform himself from villain into tragic figure, one whose good intentions had led to unfortunate consequences. "As for binding death," he continued, allowing genuine regret to enter his voice, "I acted from mortal terror rather than divine defiance. When Thanatos appeared to claim my life, I was not ready to abandon those who depended upon my protection. My people, my wife, my children, all would suffer if their king were suddenly taken from them. In my desperation to provide for their welfare, I committed an act that I now recognize as the height of presumption." The plea was carefully calculated to appeal to Persephone's own experience of being torn from loved ones, her understanding of what it meant to be separated from those whose welfare mattered more than one's own comfort. If he could establish emotional connection with the Queen of the Dead, if he could make her see his actions as misguided love rather than arrogant ambition, he might yet achieve the impossible. Hades listened to this performance with the patience of one who had heard every possible variation of mortal self-justification. Yet something in Sisyphus's approach seemed to give him pause. perhaps the sophisticated understanding of divine psychology that the mortal displayed, perhaps simple curiosity about how far such cleverness might extend. "Your words are skillfully chosen, Sisyphus," the Lord of the Dead acknowledged, "and your remorse appears genuine. Yet actions carry consequences regardless of their motivations, and the disruption you caused cannot be undone by eloquent explanations. What punishment do you believe appropriate for crimes of such magnitude?" The question was both trap and opportunity, testing whether Sisyphus would attempt to minimize his guilt or demonstrate true understanding of his situation. His response would determine not only his immediate fate, but the eternal consequences that would define his existence in the realm of the dead. "Great Hades," Sisyphus replied, "I acknowledge that my crimes merit severe punishment, and I am prepared to accept whatever judgment divine wisdom deems appropriate. Yet I would ask for one consideration, not as a plea for mercy, but as a matter of cosmic justice itself." He paused, allowing the weight of anticipation to build before delivering the argument upon which everything depended. "Your Majesties, I died without proper funeral rites. My wife, in her grief and confusion, failed to perform the sacred ceremonies that ensure peaceful passage to the afterlife. My body lies unburied, my spirit dishonored, my soul denied the dignity that even the humblest mortal deserves in death." The claim was audacious in its complexity, requiring Persephone to believe that Merup's failure to perform funeral rites was accidental rather than deliberate, that Sisyphus himself was the victim of this oversight rather than its architect. Yet the argument touched upon fundamental principles of divine justice that even the rulers of the dead could not dismiss lightly. In the silence that followed his words, Sisyphus felt the full weight of divine consideration pressing upon his consciousness. Persephone's eyes had narrowed slightly, her expression revealing the internal struggle between sympathy for apparent injustice and suspicion of manipulation. The moment stretched beyond normal time, filled with currents of supernatural thought that would determine whether his final gambit would succeed or fail. "This is a serious claim," Persephone said at last, her voice carrying undertones that Sisyphus could not entirely decipher. "If true, it represents a fundamental violation of the proper order that governs passage between life and death. No soul should be denied the dignity of appropriate burial, regardless of the crimes committed in life." The Queen of the Dead turned to consult with her husband, their conversation conducted in tones too low for mortal ears to follow. Sisyphus waited with the forced patience of one whose fate hung upon words being spoken beyond his hearing, knowing that his entire future depended upon Persephone's interpretation of cosmic justice and her willingness to grant what appeared to be a reasonable request. When the divine consultation ended, Persephone's expression had shifted toward something that might have been compassion mixed with determination to see justice properly served. She faced Sisyphus with the authority of one whose decisions shaped the destiny of souls, her words carrying the weight of cosmic law itself. "Sisyphus of Ephora," she pronounced, "your crimes are grave and merit severe punishment. Yet cosmic justice requires that all souls receive proper treatment in death, regardless of their failings in life. You shall be granted temporary return to the mortal world, but only for the purpose of ensuring that appropriate funeral rites are performed and that your passage to the afterlife follows proper procedures." The conditions she attached to this unprecedented mercy were specific and binding, designed to prevent the very kind of abuse that Sisyphus was secretly planning. "You will have 3 days to correct this oversight," Persephone continued, "after which you must return immediately to face the judgment that awaits you. Fail to honor this agreement, and the consequences will exceed anything that ordinary justice might impose." As the queen spoke these words, Sisyphus felt a surge of triumph that he carefully concealed beneath an expression of appropriate gratitude. His plan had succeeded beyond his most optimistic calculations, achieving not merely a reprieve from judgment, but an opportunity to return to the mortal world where his advantages would be restored. The clever misdirection that had convinced Persephone of his victimization rather than his manipulation represented, perhaps, the greatest achievement of his legendary career. "Your Majesty's wisdom and mercy exceed my worthiness to receive them," he replied, bowing with exactly the degree of humility that would reinforce her belief in his sincerity. "I swear by all the gods that I will use this opportunity only to ensure proper funeral rites and to prepare my soul for whatever judgment divine justice deems appropriate." The oath was carefully worded to appear comprehensive, while actually promising nothing that would prevent him from pursuing his true intentions. Sisyphus had learned long ago that the most effective deceptions were built upon technical truths that concealed deeper layers of manipulation, and his pledge to Persephone followed this principle perfectly. The return journey to the mortal world was accomplished with divine swiftness that compressed distances and collapsed the boundaries between realms. One moment, Sisyphus stood in the throne room of Hades. The next, he found himself materializing in the familiar surroundings of his palace in Ephyra, breathing the sweet air of the living world and feeling the warmth of sunlight on skin that had been touched by the absolute cold of death. The city around him continued its daily operations much as he had left it, though the eternal spring that marked his bargain with Asopus now carried additional significance as proof that divine promises, once made, endured regardless of the circumstances that had prompted them. Citizens went about their business in the marketplace. Ships arrived and departed from the harbor, and the complex machinery of commerce that he had so carefully constructed continued to function even in his absence. Yet Sisyphus had no intention of wasting his precious time on municipal administration or commercial oversight. He had achieved the impossible, a second chance at life itself, and he meant to use every moment of that opportunity to its fullest extent. The 3 days that Persephone had granted him were merely the beginning of what he intended to be a much longer reprieve from divine judgment. His first action was to locate Merope and ensure that she understood the success of their carefully coordinated deception. His divine wife had played her role perfectly, allowing her genuine grief at his apparent death to convince the powers of the underworld that her failure to perform funeral rites was accidental rather than deliberate. Now she would need to maintain that pretense while helping him plan the next phase of his resistance to cosmic authority. The reunion between husband and wife was both joyful and calculated, their embrace carrying the genuine emotion of lovers separated by death, while their whispered conversations focused on the practical details of maintaining their deception. Merope had prepared well for this moment, spreading word throughout Ephyra that her husband's funeral had been delayed due to the complex political arrangements required for a king's burial. The explanation satisfied most observers, while providing cover for the extended delay that Sisyphus's plans required. As the first day of his reprieve passed into night, Sisyphus stood once again upon the battlements of his palace, looking out over the city that his cunning had built and the waters that had brought him both opportunity and doom. The familiar satisfaction of successful manipulation filled his consciousness, though now it was tempered by the knowledge that even greater challenges lay ahead. He had tricked death and deceived the queen of the underworld herself, but those victories would mean nothing if he could not find a way to avoid returning to face the judgment that awaited him. The solution, when it came to him, was both elegant and audacious in its simplicity. Persephone had granted him 3 days to arrange proper funeral rites, but she had not specified what would happen if those arrangements proved impossible to complete. If no funeral could be conducted, if circumstances beyond his control prevented the very ceremonies that had justified his return, then logically he could not be held responsible for failing to fulfill conditions that had become impossible to meet. The plan that began to form in his mind was complex enough to challenge even his legendary skills in manipulation and misdirection. He would need to create circumstances that appeared to prevent his funeral, while actually orchestrating every detail of the apparent obstacles. Political crises would need to be manufactured. Religious authorities would need to be convinced of various complications, and the entire process would need to appear natural rather than contrived. Over the following days, Sisyphus set his plan in motion with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized all his greatest achievements. Disputes arose between rival priests about proper funeral procedures for a king who had died under supernatural circumstances. Political tensions emerged between neighboring cities that made large gatherings dangerous. Technical problems developed with the sacred materials required for royal burial rites, creating delays that seemed beyond any mortal's ability to control. Each obstacle appeared independent and natural, the result of ordinary complications rather than deliberate manipulation. Yet together they created an impenetrable web of difficulties that made it impossible to complete the funeral rites within the allotted time. As the 3rd day dawned and passed without resolution, Sisyphus allowed himself to believe that he had achieved the ultimate victory over divine authority itself. But the gods were not so easily deceived, and Persephone's patience, while considerable, was not unlimited. As the 3rd night fell without any sign of Sisyphus's voluntary return to the underworld, the queen of the dead began to suspect that her mercy had been repaid with manipulation rather than gratitude. The realization that she had been deceived by mortal cleverness filled her with a cold fury that shook the foundations of both worlds. Days passed into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years as Sisyphus continued to evade the divine summons that should have called him back to judgment. His success in avoiding his fate became legendary throughout the Greek world, inspiring both admiration and terror in those who heard the tale of a mortal who had twice cheated death and showed no signs of accepting the inevitable. Yet even as he enjoyed his extended reprieve from divine justice, Sisyphus began to notice subtle changes in the world around him that suggested his victory might be less complete than it appeared. The eternal spring that had marked his bargain with Sisyphus continued to flow, but its waters gradually took on a metallic taste that spoke of deep corruption. The prosperity of Ephora remained substantial, yet new ventures failed with increasing frequency, as though the very luck that had favored the city was slowly turning against it. More disturbing still were the dreams that began to plague his sleep, visions of divine councils, where his continued defiance was discussed with growing impatience and mounting anger. In these nocturnal revelations, he saw Zeus's rage at being twice humiliated by mortal presumption, Hades's cold fury at having his authority challenged, and Persephone's bitter regret at allowing herself to be deceived by sophisticated manipulation. The dreams carried an undertone of inevitability that no amount of conscious reasoning could dispel, a sense that forces beyond mortal comprehension were aligning themselves for a final reckoning that would brook no further delays or clever evasions. Yet Sisyphus continued to resist the growing pressure, clinging to his freedom with the desperation of one who understood that surrender would mean not merely death, but eternal punishment beyond imagination. The end, when it came, arrived with the swiftness of divine justice, finally unleashed after years of supernatural patience. Hermes appeared in Ephora not as a messenger bearing ultimatums, but as an agent of absolute authority whose arrival marked the conclusion of all negotiations and the beginning of final consequences. The god manifested in the throne room of Sisyphus's palace during the morning court session, his presence immediately recognizable to all who witnessed it, yet carrying an aspect of terrible finality that had been absent from previous divine interventions. Where Thanatos had come as executioner and Ares as captor, Hermes arrived as the personification of divine will that could no longer be delayed, defied, or deflected. Sisyphus, the messenger god, spoke with a voice that carried the authority of Olympus itself. Your time of grace is ended. Zeus has decreed that no further delays will be tolerated, no additional schemes will be permitted, and no more mercy will be extended. You will return with me immediately to face the judgment that has been postponed too long already. The words carried a finality that admitted no possibility of argument or negotiation. This was not a death sentence that might be evaded through clever tricks or supernatural intervention, but the simple statement of cosmic law that had finally decided to assert itself with absolute authority. The game that Sisyphus had played with divine patience was over, and the time for accounting had arrived. As Hermes spoke, Sisyphus felt the last vestiges of his legendary confidence finally abandoning him. The mind that had conceived schemes to outwit gods themselves now faced the reality that some forces truly were beyond mortal manipulation, some authorities genuinely immune to clever words and sophisticated misdirection. The king of Ephora, master of countless negotiations and architect of impossible victories, finally understood that he had reached the limits of what cunning could accomplish. Yet even in that moment of ultimate defeat, even as he felt the inexorable grip of divine justice closing around him, like chains forged from cosmic necessity itself, Sisyphus maintained the dignity that had defined his entire extraordinary existence. He rose from his throne with the bearing of one who had ruled wisely and well, who had built something magnificent from nothing but ambition and intelligence, who had dared to challenge the very foundations of divine authority and had come closer to success than any mortal had a right to expect. "I am ready," he said simply, the words carrying both acceptance and defiance, surrender and pride. "Let us finish what was begun so long ago." The return journey to the underworld was accomplished without ceremony or delay, Hermes' divine authority removing all obstacles and eliminating any possibility of escape or diversion. This time, there would be no clever words to create opportunities for manipulation, no sympathetic audiences to be swayed by sophisticated arguments, no weaknesses in divine psychology to be exploited for advantage. The throne room of Hades seemed unchanged from Sisyphus's previous appearance, yet the atmosphere that filled the vast chamber was fundamentally different. Where before there had been the formal procedures of initial judgment, now there was the cold certainty of final sentencing. Persephone's expression carried no trace of the sympathy that had allowed his previous escape, and Hades himself radiated the terrible patience of one whose mercy had been exhausted through deliberate abuse. "Sisyphus of Ephyra," the Lord of the Dead pronounced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. "You stand before us not as a first-time offender seeking justice, but as a repeat transgressor whose crimes have compounded through deliberate defiance of divine authority. Your deceptions have exceeded the bounds of what any power, mortal or immortal, can be expected to tolerate." The catalogue of his crimes that followed was comprehensive and damning, encompassing not merely his original betrayal of Zeus and binding of death, but his manipulation of Persephone's mercy and his years of illegal residence in the mortal world. Each transgression was detailed with the precision of divine memory that forgot nothing and forgave nothing, building toward a judgment that would reflect the full magnitude of his accumulated offenses. For crimes that exceed the normal bounds of mortal transgression, Hades continued, punishment must exceed the normal fate of ordinary souls. You who sought to bind death shall be bound yourself. You who disrupted the natural order through cleverness shall labor eternally without achievement. You who believed mortal intelligence superior to divine wisdom shall learn the futility of effort without divine blessing. The sentence, when it was finally pronounced, was both terrible and elegant in its symbolic appropriateness. Sisyphus would be taken to the deepest pit of Tartarus, where the most heinous criminals received their eternal punishments, and there he would be given a task that would occupy him for all of time, without possibility of completion or reprieve. A great stone would be provided, its weight calculated to require the maximum effort that his spirit could sustain without being crushed entirely. This boulder he would be required to push up a steep mountain, straining against its massive bulk with every fiber of his eternal being. Yet the stone was enchanted with divine justice that ensured its weight would always exceed his strength by the smallest possible margin, so that he could move it slowly upward through supreme effort, but never quite achieve the summit. At the moment when success seemed finally within reach, when the peak of the mountain lay mere inches away, the enchantment would activate and the stone would roll backward with inexorable force, tumbling down the slope to return to its starting position. Then Sisyphus would be compelled to begin again and again and again, for as long as time itself endured. The punishment was designed with exquisite precision to mirror his crimes, while providing eternal reminder of their consequences. His cleverness, which had served him so well in achieving temporary victories, would become a curse that allowed him to understand the futility of his labors while being powerless to escape them. His pride, which had led him to believe himself capable of outwitting divine authority, would be ground down through endless repetition of meaningless effort. As the sentence was pronounced, Sisyphus felt the last remnants of his legendary composure finally cracking under the weight of cosmic justice. The mind that had conceived schemes to deceive death itself now contemplated an eternity of labor without purpose, effort without achievement, striving without hope. Yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm his consciousness, the habits of a lifetime reasserted themselves, and he began to search for possibilities of escape or mitigation. But the journey to Tartarus revealed the hopelessness of such thinking with crushing finality. The deepest pit of the underworld was designed to contain the most dangerous criminals in cosmic history, its walls built from substances that existed only in the realm of divine justice, its guards drawn from forces that could not be bribed, deceived, or overcome through any mortal stratagem. The mountain that would become his eternal workplace rose before him, like a monument to futility itself, its slope calculated to provide maximum difficulty, while remaining theoretically possible to ascend. The stone that awaited him at its base was indeed massive beyond normal comprehension, yet not so large as to make effort obviously pointless. Hope, that cruelest of divine gifts, would remain with him always, ensuring that each attempt would be made with the desperate belief that this time might somehow be different. As Sisyphus placed his hands against the boulder for the first time, feeling its weight and texture and the terrible solidity that spoke of permanence beyond mortal understanding, he experienced a moment of clarity that revealed the full scope of divine justice. This was not merely punishment, but education, designed to teach him truths about the nature of existence that his earthly cleverness had obscured. The first push required every ounce of strength that his spirit possessed, the stone moving with agonizing slowness up the impossible slope. Each inch of progress demanded supreme effort. Each foot of advance brought him closer to the exhaustion that would make the next step even more difficult. Yet something in his eternal nature compelled him to continue, to strain against the massive weight with determination that exceeded rational explanation. As he climbed, Sisyphus found his mind reviewing the events that had brought him to this pass, analyzing each decision and its consequences with the bitter wisdom that came too late to serve any useful purpose. He saw now how his cleverness had become its own trap, how each successful manipulation had led to greater challenges that required even more audacious schemes to overcome. The pattern was clear in retrospect. His intelligence had indeed been extraordinary, his achievements genuinely impressive, his victories against impossible odds undeniably real. Yet all of it had served merely to elevate him to heights from which the inevitable fall would be more catastrophic, more complete, more eternal than anything that ordinary failure could have produced. The summit of the mountain seemed impossibly distant when he began, yet gradually, through effort that transcended normal limits of endurance, Sisyphus began to make genuine progress up the slope. The stone, massive as it was, yielded to his supreme exertion, rolling slowly but steadily toward the peak that would mark the completion of his task. Hope, that most dangerous of emotions, began to stir in his consciousness as the summit drew nearer. Then, at the moment when success lay within reach, when the peak of the mountain was mere inches away, and one final push would complete his labors, the divine enchantment activated with casual cruelty. The stone seemed to develop a life of its own, its weight suddenly shifting in ways that made control impossible. Despite his desperate efforts to maintain his grip, despite straining every fiber of his eternal being to prevent the inevitable, Sisyphus felt the boulder slipping from his grasp. The stone rolled backward with gathering momentum, tumbling down the slope he had climbed with such terrible effort, bouncing and crashing until it came to rest at the exact position where his labors had begun. In that moment of ultimate frustration, watching the fruit of his supreme effort vanishing in mere seconds, Sisyphus understood the true nature of his punishment with devastating clarity. This was not merely eternal labor, but eternal futility, not simply endless work, but endless meaninglessness. He would spend eternity repeating the same task, achieving the same near success, experiencing the same crushing disappointment, forever trapped in a cycle that offered neither progress nor release. His cleverness, which had once solved every problem and overcome every obstacle, was now revealed as completely useless against the simple reality of divine justice. Yet even as this realization crashed over him like waves against an unyielding shore, Sisyphus found himself walking back down the mountain toward the stone that awaited his next attempt. Something in his nature, perhaps the same drive that had led him to build a Fiera from nothing and challenge the gods themselves, compelled him to continue despite the obvious futility of his efforts. As he placed his hands against the boulder for the second time, beginning the labor that would define his existence for all eternity, Sisyphus experienced a strange transformation of consciousness. The anger and despair that had initially overwhelmed him gradually gave way to something approaching acceptance, not of his fate, but of the reality that his fate would not change, regardless of his emotional response to it. The second ascent was no easier than the first, requiring the same supreme effort and yielding the same agonizing progress toward a summit that remained as distant as ever. Yet this time, Sisyphus climbed with fuller understanding of what awaited him, and when the stone inevitably rolled back to its starting position, he was prepared for the disappointment that followed. Time in Tartarus moved according to laws that bore no resemblance to mortal chronology, making it impossible to measure how long his labors continued or how many times the pattern repeated itself. There was only the stone, the mountain, the endless cycle of effort and failure that defined his existence beyond any possibility of variation or escape. Gradually, over periods that might have been years or centuries or eons, Sisyphus began to notice subtle changes in his relationship to the task that consumed his eternal existence. The physical effort required remained as extreme as ever, the futility as absolute, the disappointment as crushing. Yet something in his attitude toward these realities had begun to shift in ways that he could not entirely explain. Perhaps it was the ultimate rebellion of consciousness against meaninglessness, or perhaps it was simply the inevitable adaptation of intelligence to unchangeable circumstances. Whatever the cause, Sisyphus found himself developing a kind of grim satisfaction in the perfection of his technique, the efficiency of his movements, the gradual understanding of how to extract maximum effect from minimum effort. He began to study the stone with scientific precision, learning its exact weight and balance, discovering the optimal points of leverage and the most effective angles of approach. He mapped every inch of the mountain's slope, identifying the terrain features that would help or hinder his progress, developing strategies that might shave precious seconds from each ascent. The irony was not lost on him that his legendary intelligence, which had proved so useless against the fundamental reality of divine justice, could still find ways to improve his performance within the constraints of his punishment. He could not escape his fate, could not achieve genuine success, could not break the cycle that bound him, but he could perfect his approach to failure, could find meaning in the process even when the outcome remained forever beyond reach. In time, though time itself had little meaning in the depths of Tartarus, Sisyphus's labors attracted the attention of other inhabitants of the underworld's deepest pit. Tantalus, forever reaching for fruit that remained just beyond his grasp, called out words of bitter encouragement during brief respites in their respective torments. Ixion, bound to his wheel of fire, offered philosophical commentary on the nature of eternal punishment that resonated with Sisyphus's own growing understanding of his situation. But it was the arrival of living visitors that marked the true transformation of Sisyphus from condemned criminal into eternal symbol. Heroes undertaking journeys to the underworld, poets seeking inspiration from the depths of human experience, and prophets pursuing visions of ultimate truth all found their way to the pit where the king of Ephyra labored with his impossible stone. The first of these witnesses was Odysseus himself, the hero whose parentage had long been whispered to include Sisyphus's bloodline, whose legendary cunning bore striking resemblance to the intelligence that had made the king of Ephyra both famous and infamous. When the wandering king descended to the underworld seeking counsel from the dead, his path inevitably led to the sight that would haunt his memory for the remainder of his extraordinary life. Odysseus found Sisyphus in the midst of yet another ascent, straining against the massive boulder with effort that seemed to exceed the limits of what any spirit, mortal or immortal, should be able to sustain. The sight struck the hero with force that transcended mere sympathy, revealing something fundamental about the nature of existence that his own struggles had only begun to illuminate. I saw the shade of Sisyphus in torment, Odysseus would later tell those who listened to his tales, bearing a huge stone with both hands. Leaning forward with hands and feet, he would thrust the stone up toward a ridge. But when it was about to go over the top, the mighty weight would turn it back, and once again, toward the plain, the pitiless stone would roll. But he would strain again and thrust it back, and sweat poured down from his limbs, and dust rose up about his head. The image burned itself into Odysseus's consciousness with the clarity of ultimate revelation, a vision of human striving reduced to its most essential elements. Here was effort without achievement, intelligence without advantage, determination without hope. Yet somehow, impossibly, the effort continued. The lesson was both terrible and magnificent, a demonstration of what mortal will could endure, even when stripped of all possibility of success. As Odysseus departed from Tartarus, carrying with him the memory of Sisyphus's eternal labor, The king of Ephyra achieved a kind of immortality that exceeded anything his earthly ambitions had imagined. His story would be told and retold across generations, his image invoked whenever mortals sought to understand the relationship between human effort and cosmic justice, his name becoming synonymous with the struggle against impossible odds. The spring that still flowed in Ephyra, the city that continued to prosper through the networks he had created, the descendants who carried forward his bloodline, all of these testified to genuine achievements that death and divine punishment could not entirely erase. Yet it was his failure, his eternal labor with the meaningless stone, that would define his legacy for all time. In the depths of Tartarus, as he continued his endless task with the grim persistence that had defined his entire extraordinary existence, Sisyphus became something more than the sum of his crimes and punishments. He became a symbol of the human condition itself, forever striving against forces beyond comprehension or control, forever discovering that the effort itself was the only meaning that existence could provide. The boulder rolled back down the mountain once more, and Sisyphus began his descent to retrieve it, his movements automatic after countless repetitions, yet somehow retaining traces of the dignity that had marked his reign as king of Ephyra. At the base of the mountain, he placed his hands once again against the stone that would occupy him for all eternity, feeling its familiar weight and texture, preparing for another ascent that would end in the same inevitable failure. Yet in that moment of beginning, in the eternal present where his punishment unfolded without variation or hope of reprieve, Sisyphus achieved a victory that divine justice had never intended to grant him. He had become eternal, not through the clever schemes that had defined his mortal existence, but through the simple act of enduring, of continuing, of refusing to surrender his essential humanity, even in the face of cosmic indifference. The stone began its slow journey up the mountain once more, pushed by hands that would never tire and guided by intelligence that would never stop seeking better ways to accomplish an impossible task. Behind him, the shadows of Tartarus stretched into darkness beyond measurement, while ahead the summit beckoned with the same false promise it had offered countless times before. But Sisyphus no longer climbed toward the summit. He climbed because climbing was what remained to him, what defined him, what made him eternally and recognizably himself, despite the transformation that divine justice had wrought upon his spirit. In accepting the stone, he had found the only freedom that remained available to him, the freedom to choose his attitude toward circumstances that no choice could change. The echo of his labors resonated through the depths of the underworld and beyond, carrying to the surface world, where mortals still struggled with their own impossible stones, their own unreachable summits, their own eternal labors that defined the human condition. His story had become their story, his fate a mirror reflecting the ultimate futility and magnificent persistence that marked every mortal life. And so Sisyphus continues still, pushing his boulder up the mountain of eternity, achieving nothing yet achieving everything, defeated by divine justice, yet victorious over meaninglessness itself. The king of Ephyra had sought to outwit the gods and had instead become something far more valuable, an eternal testament to the magnificent absurdity of human striving in a cosmos that offers effort as its own reward. The stone rolls upward, inch by impossible inch, carrying with it the weight of all mortal ambition, and the lightness of acceptance that transcends understanding. At the summit waits the inevitable failure, and at the base waits the inevitable return. Between them stretches the eternal moment where Sisyphus labors, neither hoping nor despairing, but simply enduring in the only way that consciousness can endure, by continuing to be itself against all odds and despite all consequences. His legacy rippled outward from the depths of Tartarus, like waves from a stone cast into still water, touching every corner of the mortal world where his story was told and retold. In the councils of kings, his name became a byword. For the dangers of excessive ambition, a cautionary tale about the limits of mortal cleverness when set against divine authority. Yet in the hearts of common people, those who labored daily with their own heavy burdens and impossible tasks, Sisyphus became something approaching a patron saint of persistence, a symbol that even the gods could not break the human spirit that refused to surrender. Poets found in his eternal labor a metaphor that captured truths about existence that no direct statement could convey. The image of the man pushing his stone up the endless mountain spoke to something fundamental in the human experience, the sense that all effort might ultimately prove futile, yet remained somehow necessary, somehow dignifying, somehow worth the cost it extracted from those who undertook it. Philosophers debated the meaning of his punishment, some seeing it as evidence of cosmic cruelty, while others found in it proof of cosmic justice perfectly calibrated to the crime. The more thoughtful among them recognized that both interpretations might be true simultaneously, that divine justice might operate according to principles that exceeded human understanding, while still serving purposes that human reason could dimly perceive. In the schools where young princes learned the arts of kingship, teachers used the story of Sisyphus to illustrate the importance of humility, the dangers of hubris, and the ultimate subordination of mortal authority to divine will. Yet those same students often found themselves secretly admiring the audacity that had led one man to challenge the very foundations of cosmic order, to achieve victories that no rational mind should have believed possible, to live and die entirely on his own terms, despite the terrible price such independence demanded. The spring that still bubbled in what had once been Ephyra, but was now called Corinth, served as a permanent reminder of Sisyphus's one enduring victory over divine authority. Travelers who drank from its waters carried the story to distant lands, spreading the tale of the king who had bargained with gods and won concessions that would outlast empires. The irony was perfect and profound. His greatest success had survived while his greatest failure continued eternally, both serving as testimonies to the complex relationship between mortal ambition and cosmic justice. In the temples where priests offered sacrifices to ensure divine favor, the name of Sisyphus was invoked as an example of what befell those who forgot their proper place in the cosmic order. Yet even these warnings carried undertones of admiration for the sheer scope of his achievements, the unprecedented nature of his victories, the magnificent scale of both his success and his downfall. The merchants who followed the trade routes he had established continued to prosper, their caravans and ships carrying goods through channels that his intelligence had first identified and his diplomacy had secured. The political arrangements he had negotiated continued to shape relationships between kingdoms generations after his death, proving that mortal cleverness, properly applied, could indeed create changes that outlasted the lifespan of their creator. Yet it was in the darker corners of human experience that Sisyphus's influence proved most profound and lasting. Those who found themselves trapped in situations that seemed to offer no escape, who faced tasks that appeared impossible yet could not be abandoned, who struggled against forces that consistently defeated their best efforts. All of these discovered in his story a kind of companionship that transcended the boundaries between myth and reality. The slave laboring in fields that would never belong to him, the soldier fighting in wars that seemed to accomplish nothing, the mother caring for children who would grow up to face the same struggles she had endured, all found in Sisyphus's eternal labor a reflection of their own experiences that somehow made those experiences more bearable. If the king of Ephyra could continue his impossible task with dignity intact, if he could find meaning in meaninglessness and purpose in futility, then perhaps ordinary mortals could do the same with their own more modest but equally persistent struggles. As centuries passed and the immediate political circumstances that had shaped Sisyphus's life faded into historical obscurity, his story underwent a curious transformation. The specific details of his crimes, the betrayal of Zeus, the violation of hospitality, the binding of death, gradually became less important than the universal elements of his experience. The struggle against impossible odds, the refusal to surrender despite hopeless circumstances, the discovery that effort itself could provide meaning, even when success remained forever beyond reach. The boulder he pushed became every burden that consciousness was compelled to bear. The mountain he climbed became every challenge that life presented to those brave enough or foolish enough to attempt overcoming it. The eternal repetition of his task became the daily renewal of hope and effort that marked every mortal existence, the constant beginning again that defined the human condition more accurately than any philosophical treatise. In the depths of Tartarus, unaware of the legacy that bore his name across the surface world, Sisyphus continued his eternal labor with the same meticulous attention to technique that had characterized all his endeavors. The stone required his complete concentration, demanding constant adjustment of grip and stance and leverage to maintain the slow progress up the mountain's slope. Yet even as his hands and shoulders and back strained against the massive weight, his mind remained free to roam across the memories and insights that comprised his true treasure. He thought often of Ephyra in its prime, when the harbor filled with ships from distant lands, and the marketplace bustled with traders speaking dozens of languages. The satisfaction of those years remained untarnished by subsequent events, a golden thread of genuine achievement that neither death nor divine punishment could sever. He had built something magnificent from nothing but ambition and intelligence, had created prosperity and security for thousands of people, had left behind a legacy of actual accomplishment that would endure regardless of his personal fate. He remembered Merope not as the divine collaborator in his deceptions, but as the woman who had shared his bed and borne his children, who had understood his dreams and supported his ambitions even when they led toward dangerous territory. The love they had shared transcended the political calculations that had initially brought them together, becoming something genuine and valuable that divine justice had acknowledged by allowing her to remain free from the punishment that claimed him. Most surprisingly, he found himself thinking with something approaching fondness of the gods who had become his adversaries. Zeus, for all his rage at being deceived, had shown a kind of grudging respect for the mortal who had dared match wits with divine authority. Persephone's anger at being manipulated was matched by her evident admiration for the sophistication of the deception that had convinced her. Even Hades, in pronouncing the eternal sentence, had acknowledged the unprecedented nature of crimes that exceeded normal categories of transgression. The relationship between mortal and divine, Sisyphus had come to understand, was more complex than simple subordination of the weak to the strong. The gods needed mortals not merely as worshippers, but as subjects worthy of their attention, beings capable of choices and actions significant enough to merit divine intervention. In challenging cosmic authority, he had actually affirmed its importance, demonstrating through his rebellion the reality of the power he had attempted to circumvent. This insight carried profound implications that extended far beyond his personal circumstances. If the gods required worthy adversaries to give meaning to their authority, then perhaps mortal defiance served cosmic purposes even when it resulted in divine punishment. Perhaps his eternal labor was not merely retribution, but a kind of cosmic necessity, a demonstration that the universe contained forces capable of resistance, even when resistance proved ultimately futile. The stone reached its familiar position near the summit, teetering on the edge of success that would never quite arrive. Sisyphus paused in his labors, feeling the familiar moment of tension when hope and experience warred in his consciousness. Despite knowing with absolute certainty what would happen next, despite having witnessed the same sequence countless times before, some portion of his spirit still believed that this attempt might somehow prove different. Perhaps the enchantment would fail. Perhaps divine attention would turn elsewhere. Perhaps the simple persistence of his efforts would finally overcome the cosmic forces that held him in eternal bondage. The hope was irrational, contradicted by infinite repetition, yet it persisted with the stubborn vitality that marked consciousness itself. To hope despite hopelessness was perhaps the most fundamentally human trait, the characteristic that distinguished mortals from both gods and beasts. The stone began its inevitable backward roll, gathering momentum as it tumbled down the slope toward the starting position that had become as familiar as his own reflection. Sisyphus watched its descent with eyes that held neither surprise nor despair, but rather a kind of professional interest in the precise mechanics of the process that defined his existence. Each time the pattern repeated, he learned something new about the forces involved, the angles and speeds and trajectories that shaped the stone's return journey. Such knowledge served no practical purpose, could not be applied to prevent or alter the outcome that awaited every ascent. Yet the accumulation of understanding satisfied something deep in his nature, the same drive toward comprehension that had made him a master of political intrigue and commercial strategy. Intelligence, it seemed, would continue to function even when its applications had been reduced to analyzing the details of one's own eternal futility. At the base of the mountain, the stone settled into its accustomed position, with the finality of cosmic law asserting itself. Sisyphus began his descent toward it, his movements automatic, yet somehow retaining traces of the dignity that had marked his reign as king of Ephyra. Each step downward carried him closer to the beginning of another cycle, another attempt, another demonstration that consciousness would persist in its efforts, even when those efforts had been proven meaningless by divine decree. Yet as he approached the boulder for what might have been the millionth time, or the billionth, or a number beyond mortal calculation, Sisyphus experienced something that approached contentment. Not happiness. That emotion belonged to realms where success remained possible, but a deeper satisfaction that came from perfect alignment between one's nature and one's circumstances. He was, in the most complete sense possible, exactly what he had always been, a consciousness that refused to surrender, that continued to strive regardless of obstacles, that found in effort itself the only meaning that existence required. The paradox was exquisite and profound. In seeking to escape the limitations of mortal existence, he had achieved a kind of immortality that exceeded anything his earthly ambitions had imagined. His punishment had become his purpose, his failure, his greatest success, his eternal bondage, the ultimate expression of his freedom to remain fundamentally himself, despite all attempts to change or break him. As his hands closed once more around the familiar surface of the stone, feeling its weight and texture, and the terrible solidity that spoke of permanence beyond mortal understanding, Sisyphus smiled with genuine humor at the cosmic joke that had made him both victim and victor, prisoner and symbol, defeated king and eternal inspiration to all who struggled against impossible odds. The stone began its slow ascent, pushed by hands that would never tire and guided by intelligence that would never stop seeking better ways to accomplish an impossible task. In the shadows of Tartarus, in the depths where the most heinous criminals received their eternal punishments, the laughter of a king echoed through chambers that had never heard such sound before. Sisyphus had finally understood the ultimate truth that all his cleverness had previously obscured. The meaning of existence lay not in achieving victory over cosmic forces, but in maintaining one's essential humanity despite cosmic indifference. The gods had sought to break him and had instead revealed the unbreakable core of consciousness that no external power could touch or alter. Behind him, eternity stretched into darkness beyond measurement. Ahead of him, the summit beckoned with the same false promise it had offered countless times before. Between them lay the eternal moment where effort met resistance, where will encountered limitation, where the human spirit demonstrated its magnificent refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat had been made absolute by divine decree. And in that moment, in the space between beginning and ending, that contained all of life's essential truth, Sisyphus pushed his stone toward a summit he would never reach, in pursuit of a success he would never achieve, animated by a hope that proved stronger than knowledge and more enduring than the gods themselves had imagined possible. The legend was complete, the lesson eternal, the symbol established for as long as consciousness existed, to contemplate the magnificent futility of its own persistent striving. In the depths of divine punishment, the king of Ephyra had found the ultimate kingdom, a realm where effort was its own reward and persistence its own victory, where the boulder rolled forever upward toward summits that existed not in space, but in the undying determination of the spirit that refused to surrender. Thus ends the tale of Sisyphus, whose name would echo through eternity, not as a warning against hubris, but as a testament to the invincible power of consciousness to create meaning from meaninglessness, purpose from futility, and triumph from the very completeness of defeat. In learning to push his stone, he had learned to bear the weight of existence itself, and in that learning had achieved an immortality more profound than any his earthly schemes had ever aspired to attain.